Imagine 40,000 people standing in the scorching Texas sun, watching two massive locomotives racing toward each other at 60 miles per hour. No one running away. No one seeking shelter. Just thousands of men, women, and children cheering as tons of iron and steam hurtled toward inevitable destruction. This was not an accident. This was not a tragedy. This was the plan. A railroad company actually built an entire city, gave it a name, and invited the whole country to come watch two trains annihilate each other in the most spectacular collision ever staged. And what happened next would turn celebration into catastrophe in ways nobody saw coming. September 15th, 1896. The heat hung thick over central Texas like a wool blanket soaked in sweat. But that didn't stop over 40,000 people from pouring into a place that hadn't existed just 6 weeks earlier. They came by train, by wagon, by horse, and some even walked for days. All of them heading toward the same destination, a temporary city called Crush, Texas. Yes, you heard that right. Crush, Texas. A city built for one purpose and one purpose only: to watch two massive locomotives smash into each other at full throttle. No other reason, no future, no plans beyond that single moment of destruction. And the craziest part? The railroad company sponsored the whole thing. They actually paid for it. They advertised it. They encouraged people to come witness this spectacular disaster with their own eyes. Think about that for a second. In an era when a train ticket cost more than most people made in a week, tens of thousands of Americans decided that watching two trains collide was absolutely worth the trip. Families packed lunches, photographers hauled their heavy equipment across the state. Newspaper reporters came from as far as New York and California. Everyone wanted a piece of this madness. The man behind this insanity was William George Crush, a passenger agent for the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, known to most folks as the Katy Railroad. Now, William was not an engineer. He was not a scientist. He was a marketing guy, and he understood something fundamental about human nature that still holds true today. People will travel incredible distances to see something get destroyed in spectacular fashion. The Katy Railroad was struggling. Competition was fierce, and they needed something big, something bold, but something that would put them on the map and fill their passenger cars. William pitched his idea to the company executives, and somehow, against all logic and reason, they said yes. They gave him the green light to orchestrate what would become one of the most dangerous publicity stunts in American history. The plan was simple in concept, but wild in execution. Take two old locomotives that had reached the end of their useful lives. Paint one of them bright green. Paint the other one crimson red. Build a temporary track stretching 4 miles long. Construct a whole town around it, complete with restaurants, saloons, a jail, telegraph office, and even a makeshift courthouse. Then, on the appointed day, send both trains screaming toward each other at top speed and let physics do the rest. No safety barriers, no insurance policies. No emergency medical teams standing by. Just pure, unfiltered chaos waiting to happen. And somehow, this seemed like a brilliant idea to everyone involved. The company printed up posters, sent out press releases, and waited to see if anyone would actually show up to this manufactured catastrophe. They were about to find out that Americans had an appetite for destruction that nobody could have predicted. The stage was set. The trains were ready. And William George Crush was about to make history, though not quite in the way he had imagined. But first they had to build a city. And not just any city. They had to construct an entire functioning town in the middle of absolutely nowhere in less than 2 months, all for an event that would last maybe 10 seconds. The location they chose was a stretch of empty prairie about 15 miles north of Waco, Texas. There was nothing there. No buildings, no roads, no people. Just flat land, dried grass, and the occasional rattlesnake. But William Crush saw potential. He saw a blank canvas where he could create the most talked-about event in America. Construction began in late July 1896. Hundreds of workers descended on the site with hammers, saws, and determination. They worked from sunrise to sunset, racing against the calendar. First came the railroad tracks, a special 4-mile stretch built specifically for the collision. Then came the platforms where spectators would stand. Then came everything else. Within weeks, a town materialized out of dust and determination. They built a restaurant that could serve 2,000 meals a day, and 3 drink stands went up to keep the crowds from dying of thirst in the brutal Texas heat. A grandstand rose from the earth, offering premium seating for those willing to pay extra. They even constructed a circus tent big enough to hold hundreds of people, because apparently watching 2 trains crash was not enough entertainment for one day. The attention to detail was remarkable for something so temporary. They installed a telegraph office so reporters could send their stories back to newspapers across the country in real time. They built a wooden jail, because where there are crowds and alcohol, there is always someone who needs to cool off behind bars. They set up a temporary depot where the trains would arrive carrying thousands of passengers. They even gave the streets names, laid out in a proper grid pattern, and as if this town might actually have a future beyond September 15th. The railroad company printed special tickets for the event. Round-trip fare from anywhere in Texas was just $2. That was incredibly cheap for 1896, deliberately priced to get as many people as possible to show up. And it worked. Requests for tickets flooded in from every corner of the state and beyond. People who had never traveled more than 20 miles from their homes suddenly wanted to journey across Texas to see this spectacle. Newspapers picked up the story and ran with it. Headlines screamed about the upcoming collision. Artists drew elaborate illustrations of what they imagined the crash would look like. Everyone had an opinion. Some called it brilliant entertainment, others called it dangerous stupidity. But everyone was talking about it, which was exactly what William Crush wanted. The 2 locomotives chosen for destruction were polished and prepared like prize fighters before a championship bout. Engine number 999 was painted a brilliant green that gleamed in the sunlight. Engine number 1001 was painted deep red, the color of blood and warning. Both were old models, past their prime for regular service, but still fully functional and powerful enough to put on the show of a lifetime. As August turned to September, the anticipation grew unbearable. The city of Crush was complete, the trains were ready, the tickets were sold. All that remained was for the crowds to arrive, and for William George Crush to prove that his wild idea was either genius or the biggest mistake of his career. They came in numbers that shocked even William Crush himself. The railroad company had hoped for maybe 10,000 people. They got 40,000. Some estimates put the crowd even higher, closer to 50,000 souls, all converging on a town that had not existed 2 months earlier. The trains started arriving the night before, packed beyond capacity. People hung out of windows. They stood in the aisles. Some even rode on the roofs of the cars, clinging to whatever they could grab, determined not to miss this event. Every single train car the Katy Railroad owned was pressed into service, running back and forth, bringing more and more people to Crush, Texas. Families arrived with picnic baskets and blankets, treating this like a county fair. Mothers carried babies on their hips. Fathers hoisted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Teenagers ran wild through the temporary streets, drunk on freedom and excitement. Old-timers who had survived the Civil War came to see something they never imagined possible. Confederate veterans stood next to Union veterans, united for once in their desire to witness mechanical destruction. The crowd was not just Texans. People traveled from Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri. Some came from as far as California and New York, taking multiple trains over several days just to be there. Photographers hauled their bulky equipment across state lines. Journalists sharpened their pencils and prepared their notebooks. Artists set up easels to capture the moment on canvas. The atmosphere was pure carnival. Vendors moved through the crowd, selling everything imaginable. Lemonade at 5 cents a glass, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, peanuts roasted in the shell, and souvenir programs describing the event and the locomotives, commemorative photographs, even little toy trains that kids could smash together, practicing for the main event. Circus performers entertained the waiting masses. A man swallowed swords while a woman walked a tightrope strung between 2 poles. A strong man lifted weights and challenged anyone brave enough to arm wrestle him. Musicians played fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars. Somewhere in the crowd, a preacher stood on a box and warned that this event was an affront to God, that man should not create destruction for entertainment. Nobody listened to him. The saloons did incredible business. Cowboys from nearby ranches came to drink and gamble and watch the show. They placed bets on everything: which train would suffer more damage, whether both engineers would survive, and how far the debris would scatter. Money changed hands faster than the bartenders could pour whiskey. By mid-morning on September 15th, Crush, Texas, was the second largest city in the entire state. Only Houston and San Antonio had more people. This temporary town in the middle of nowhere had become, for one day, one of the most populated places in Texas. And every single person there had come for the same reason: to see 2 trains destroy each other. The heat was already oppressive. The sun beat down without mercy. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet hung in the air like fog. People fanned themselves with newspapers and programs. Some women carried parasols for shade. Men rolled up their sleeves and loosened their collars. But nobody left. Nobody complained. The discomfort was a small price to pay for what they were about to witness. The energy in the air was electric, almost dangerous in its intensity. 40,000 people, all focused on one thing, all waiting for the same moment. The crowd pressed closer to the tracks, eager for the best view, unaware that the best view might also be the most deadly. At exactly 5 p.m., the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. A hush fell over the massive crowd as officials began making final preparations. The carnival atmosphere shifted into something more focused, more intense. This was it. This was what they came for. The 2 locomotives sat at opposite ends of the 4-mile track, facing each other like gunslingers before a duel. Engine 999, painted green and gleaming in the late afternoon sun, waited at the north end. Engine 1001, red as a fresh wound, idled at the south end. Both engines were already under pressure, steam hissing from their valves, smoke rising from their stacks. They were alive, breathing, ready. The engineers who would drive these trains to their destruction were not volunteers. They were professionals, experienced railroad men who knew exactly how dangerous this job was. But they were being paid well, and in 1896, well-paid work was hard to turn down. Their job was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Get the trains up to full speed, then jump off before impact. Just jump off a train going 60 miles per hour. Easy, right? 6 passenger cars were attached behind each locomotive, all of them empty except for the very last car on each train. Those cars were loaded with railroad ties, adding weight to ensure the collision would be as spectacular as possible. The organizers wanted maximum destruction, and physics demanded mass. William Crush himself stood near the center of the track, megaphone in hand, sweating through his suit despite the late hour. His moment had arrived. His idea, his plan, his event. Tens of thousands of people had shown up. The newspapers were watching. The whole country was paying attention. He was either about to become famous or infamous, and there was no turning back now. He raised the megaphone and addressed the crowd. His voice carried across the prairie, explaining what was about to happen as if anyone there did not already know. The trains would start simultaneously. They would accelerate to full speed. They would collide somewhere near the center of the track. He assured everyone that they were at a safe distance. He promised them a show they would never forget. The crowd cheered. Hats flew into the air. People whistled and hollered. Some were already crying from excitement. Parents hoisted children higher on their shoulders. Photographers prepared their cameras, knowing they had exactly one chance to capture this moment. Artists gripped their pencils, ready to sketch the collision from memory, since it would happen too fast to draw in real time. At each end of the track, the engineers climbed into their cabs. They checked their gauges one last time. They gripped the throttles. They looked down that long stretch of track toward the distant engine that would be their target and their doom. Behind them, the crowd pressed even closer to the track, ignoring the warnings to stay back. Human nature took over. Everyone wanted the best view. Everyone wanted to be as close as possible to the action, though the signal was given. Both engineers pulled their throttles wide open. Both locomotives lurched forward, slowly at first, heavy and ponderous like sleeping giants waking up. Black smoke poured from their stacks. Steam burst from their pistons. The sound was incredible, a deep mechanical roar that shook the ground and rattled in people's chests. The trains picked up speed. Faster, faster. The crowd's cheering grew louder, competing with the scream of the engines. The gap between the two locomotives closed rapidly, impossibly fast, tons of metal and momentum racing toward each other with nothing to stop them except each other. The engineers had about 90 seconds to get their trains up to full speed and then save their own lives. 90 seconds to push these massive machines to their absolute limit and then abandon them to their fate. And the mathematics were brutal and simple. 4 miles of track, 2 trains, top speed around 60 miles per hour each. That meant they would meet in the middle in less than 2 minutes. Both men watched their speedometers climb. 40 miles per hour, 50, 55. The engines shook and rattled. The world outside became a blur. The noise was deafening, a mechanical scream of metal and steam pushed beyond what was safe or sane. Every rivet in these locomotives vibrated. Every bolt was tested. These were old engines, remember, machines at the end of their working lives, and they were being driven harder than they had been driven in years. At about the halfway point, both engineers made their move. They locked the throttles wide open, ensuring the trains would keep accelerating even without anyone at the controls. Then they jumped. They leaped from locomotives moving at nearly 60 miles per hour, throwing themselves onto the dirt and grass beside the tracks, rolling and tumbling, praying their bones would not shatter on impact. Both men survived the jump. Bruised, battered, probably terrified, but alive. They picked themselves up and ran, getting as far from the track as possible, because even though they had just done the impossible, they were smart enough to know that standing anywhere near 2 colliding trains was a death wish. The locomotives continued without them. Driverless, unstoppable, pure momentum and metal hurtling toward each other with mathematical certainty. The green engine and the red engine, each pulling 6 cars loaded with thousands of pounds of timber, both machines screaming along the track at speeds that made the rails sing. The crowd watched in awe. 40,000 people held their breath as one. Children stared wide-eyed. Women gripped their husbands' arms. Men leaned forward, mesmerized. Time seemed to slow down even as the train sped up. Every eye was locked on those 2 engines, watching the gap close, watching history happen in real time. Half a mile apart. Quarter mile. The sound was already incredible, but it grew louder, a mechanical thunder that drowned out everything else. The ground shook. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the approaching impact. People started screaming, not in fear but in excitement, a primal roar from thousands of throats, all releasing tension at once. 100 yards, 50 yards, 25. The trains were moving so fast that the human eye could barely track them. They were streaks of color, blurs of motion, forces of nature more than machines. The photographers squeezed their shutter releases. The artists tried desperately to burn this image into their memories. The crowd surged forward despite the danger, despite the warnings, because humans always want to be closer to spectacle, closer to destruction, closer to the moment when everything changes. 10 yards, 5, and then impact. The two locomotives met almost exactly in the center of the track, precisely where William Crush had calculated they would. The green nose of engine 999 struck the red nose of engine 1001 at a combined speed of over 100 miles per hour. For one frozen instant, before the destruction really began, they were locked together like two bulls with horns interlocked, neither giving an inch. Then physics took over, and everything went straight to hell. The sound of the collision was like nothing anyone had ever heard. Imagine the loudest thunderclap you have ever experienced, then multiply it by 100. Metal screamed against metal. Wooden cars splintered like matchsticks. The locomotives crumpled like paper, their fronts crushing inward, absorbing the impact of all that momentum, converting to destruction in a fraction of a second. The crowd roared its approval. This was exactly what they came to see. Two massive machines destroying each other in spectacular fashion. The noise, the violence, the sheer audacity of it all. For one perfect moment, everything was going according to plan. The collision was magnificent. The wreckage was instant and total. And then, something that nobody had planned for, nobody had predicted, and nobody could stop. Both boilers exploded. The boilers inside each locomotive had been under tremendous pressure, pushing the engines to maximum speed. Now, with that metal crushed and compromised, that pressure had nowhere to go except out. The boilers ruptured almost simultaneously, releasing superheated steam and sending chunks of metal flying in every direction like shrapnel from a bomb. The explosions were massive. Witnesses later said it looked like a volcano erupting on the prairie. A mushroom cloud of steam and smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air. The sound was even louder than the initial collision, a deep boom that rattled windows in Waco 15 miles away. People inside buildings in town ran outside, thinking they were under attack or that the world was ending. But the explosions were just the beginning of the nightmare. The real horror came in what happened next. All that debris, all those pieces of shredded locomotive, thousands of pounds of metal moving at lethal speed, flew outward from the impact point like a deadly bloom. Bolts the size of fists, chunks of boiler as big as trunks, pieces of rail, fragments of wheel, shards of glass from the locomotive windows. All of it became projectiles, all of it traveling with enough force to kill. The crowd that had pressed so close to the track, desperate for the best view, suddenly found themselves in the path of destruction. There was no time to run, no time to duck, no time to do anything except experience the sudden, terrible realization that they had made a catastrophic mistake. A piece of metal the size of a small table flew through the air and struck a man in the chest, killing him instantly. Another fragment caught a woman in the head. She dropped without a sound. A teenage boy who had climbed a pole for a better view was hit by debris and fell, breaking his back on the way down. People started screaming, but now it was terror instead of excitement. Smaller pieces rained down like hail. A bolt struck a photographer, destroying his camera and shattering his collarbone. Glass fragments cut dozens of faces. Hot metal burned anyone it touched. The debris field spread hundreds of yards in every direction. Even people who thought they were safely distant found themselves dodging falling wreckage. The wooden cars behind the locomotives fared no better. The impact had sent them flying into the air, tumbling end over end like toys. They crashed back to Earth in splinters. Railroad ties from the cargo cars became missiles, scattering across the field. The one tie flew over 200 yards and smashed through the wall of the restaurant, sending workers diving for cover. In less than 10 seconds, the greatest publicity stunt in railroad history had transformed into one of the worst disasters in Texas history. The cheering had turned to screaming. The celebration had become a tragedy, and 40,000 people who had come to watch destruction from a safe distance suddenly discovered there was no safe distance at all. Chaos. Pure, absolute chaos. 40,000 people, moments ago unified in excitement, now scattered in every direction like startled birds. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Men who had been laughing and placing bets now stumbled over each other in blind panic. Women screamed, their voices cutting through the lingering rumble of the explosion. The organized crowd became a stampede of terrified humanity, all trying to escape from danger that had already struck. But not everyone could run. Some people lay on the ground, wounded or dying. Others stood frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Blood mixed with dust on the prairie grass. The smell of burning metal and coal smoke filled the air, along with something worse, the smell of burnt flesh and copper that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The official death toll would eventually be recorded as 3 people, but many historians believe the real number was higher. In the confusion and panic, some bodies may have been carried away by family members who wanted to avoid questions or legal trouble. Some of the injured probably died later from wounds that were not immediately fatal. And in 1896, record-keeping in the middle of a disaster was not exactly thorough. One confirmed victim was a young man named Jeremiah Dean. He had traveled from Louisiana specifically for this event, excited to see history made. A chunk of boiler struck him in the head, killing him before his body hit the ground. He was 19 years old. He had told his mother he would be back in 3 days with stories to tell. Another victim was a woman whose name was never recorded in official reports. Witnesses said she was holding a baby when the debris struck her. The baby survived without a scratch. She did not. Someone scooped up the crying infant and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her body behind because there was simply too much happening. Too many people hurt, too much confusion to properly care for the dead. Dozens more were injured. At least 6 people lost eyes from flying glass and metal fragments. Others suffered broken bones from falling or being struck by debris. Burns covered the arms and faces of people who had been too close when the superheated steam exploded outward. One man lost 3 fingers when a piece of metal sliced through his hand like a blade. The temporary jail, which had been built to handle drunk and rowdy spectators, became an emergency medical station filled with bleeding, groaning victims. There were no ambulances, no emergency medical teams, no hospitals nearby. The doctors and nurses who happened to be in the crowd did what they could with whatever supplies they could find. Tablecloths from the restaurant became bandages. Whiskey from the saloons became antiseptic. The telegraph office sent urgent messages to Waco begging for medical help. But Waco was 15 miles away, and it would take hours for proper assistance to arrive. Meanwhile, the wreckage still burned. Small fires had broken out where hot metal had landed on dry grass. Men formed bucket lines to prevent the flames from spreading, worried that the whole temporary town might catch fire and turn this disaster into something even worse. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of blood. Children cried for parents they could not find. Parents called out names of children who did not answer. William Crush stood near the center of it all, his face pale, his hands shaking. This was his event, his idea, his responsibility. He had promised everyone a safe and spectacular show. He had delivered the spectacular part. The safe part had gone catastrophically wrong. He watched people tend to the wounded and carry away the dead. And he knew that his life had just changed forever, in ways he could not yet fully understand. The sun began to set over Crush, Texas, painting the sky in brilliant reds and oranges, beautiful and terrible, like the world was on fire. The next morning, newspapers across America carried the story on their front pages. But the tone was not what the Katy Railroad had hoped for. Instead of celebrating a spectacular publicity stunt, headlines screamed about death and disaster. Train crash turns deadly in Texas. Read one. Spectators killed at railroad exhibition, declared another. Disaster at Crush was the simple, devastating headline in the Dallas Morning News. The railroad company went into immediate damage control mode. They knew lawsuits were coming. They knew their reputation was on the line. They knew they needed to act fast, or this disaster would destroy them far more thoroughly than those two locomotives had destroyed each other. First, they fired William George Crush, or at least that is what they announced publicly. The man whose name had been given to the temporary town, the man whose idea had brought 40,000 people to the middle of nowhere, was officially dismissed from his position with the Katy Railroad. The message was clear. This was his fault, not theirs. He had planned it, he had organized it, and when it went wrong, he was the one who would take the blame. Except that story lasted exactly 1 day. 24 hours after firing him, the railroad quietly rehired William Crush. Why? Because firing him meant admitting he had acted alone, without company approval. And if he had acted alone, that meant the company had lost control of one of their employees. But if they admitted they had approved his plan, then they were responsible for the deaths and injuries. So they brought him back and kept him on staff, just in a different role, one where he would not be making decisions about smashing trains together in front of crowds. It was a perfect piece of corporate maneuvering. They could not quite figure out how to pin this entirely on him without hurting themselves, so they chose the path of least legal exposure. Then came the settlements. The railroad company moved quickly to pay off the families of the dead and the people who had been injured. They did not wait for lawsuits. They did not fight in court. They simply showed up with cash and agreements that needed to be signed. Sign this paper saying, "You will not sue us. And here is money for your medical bills, your lost wages, your pain and suffering." Most people signed. What else could they do? In 1896, suing a major railroad company meant years of expensive legal battles with no guarantee of winning. Taking the settlement money meant at least getting something, getting it now, and being able to move on with life. The railroad knew this. They counted on it. And it worked. The investigation into what went wrong was brief and largely pointless. Engineers who examined the wreckage said the boiler explosions were probably caused by the violent impact, rupturing the pressure vessels. But there was also speculation that the boilers had been overpressured to begin with, pumped up beyond safe levels to ensure the trains would be going fast enough for a spectacular collision. And nobody could prove it either way because the boilers were scattered across half an acre in pieces too small to properly examine. No criminal charges were filed. No one went to jail. The local sheriff interviewed witnesses and wrote reports. But in the end, what law had been broken? People had come voluntarily to watch a dangerous spectacle. They had been warned to stay back. Some had ignored those warnings and gotten too close. Tragic, certainly. Criminal. The law was not clear on that point in 1896. The temporary city of Crush was dismantled almost as quickly as it had been built. Within a week, the restaurant was torn down. The grandstand was disassembled. The telegraph office was packed up and hauled away. The streets that had been named and laid out in a grid disappeared back into prairie grass. Soon, but there was no evidence that a town had ever existed there at all, except for the wreckage. The twisted metal from the two locomotives sat there for months, slowly rusting, a monument to human folly and the price of entertainment. The strangest part of the whole Crash at Crush disaster was what happened next in the court of public opinion. You would think that an event that killed and injured spectators would be universally condemned. that people would be horrified, that the idea of staging such a dangerous stunt would be permanently discredited. You would be wrong. The event became legendary. Not infamous. Legendary. People talked about it for decades. Those who had been there became celebrities in their own communities, dining out on their stories of survival for years. And children begged their parents to tell them about the day they saw the trains crash. The crash at Crush became part of Texas folklore, a story passed down through generations. Souvenir hunters descended on the wreckage site for months. They pried pieces of metal from the twisted locomotives and carried them home as trophies. Bolts, valve handles, fragments of the boilers, pieces of the wooden cars, anything they could detach and haul away. Some of these souvenirs are still in Texas homes today, more than a century later, displayed like holy relics from a pilgrimage to witness destruction. The photographers who had captured images of the collision and its aftermath sold those photos for years. They became some of the most widely distributed photographs in America. You could buy postcards showing the moment of impact, the mushroom cloud of steam, the wreckage scattered across the prairie. People sent these postcards to friends and family with messages like, "Wish you were here," and "Saw this in person. It was amazing." Think about that. People were sending postcards of a disaster that killed multiple people, and they were doing it with excitement and pride. The Victorian era had a complicated relationship with death and spectacle, and the crash at Crush sat right at that intersection. Other railroad companies, instead of learning the lesson that staged train crashes were dangerous and stupid, actually started planning their own collision events. Several smaller companies announced they would hold similar spectacles, promising even bigger crashes, even more spectacular destruction. As local governments had to step in and pass laws specifically forbidding staged train collisions, because apparently common sense was not enough. William George Crush lived another 60 years. He died in 1936, having spent his entire life working for the railroad in various capacities. Whenever anyone asked him about the crash, he would smile and say it was the most well-attended event in Texas history up to that point, which was true. He rarely mentioned the people who died. He focused on the achievement, the spectacle, the fact that his idea had worked exactly as planned right up until the boilers exploded. The location where Crush, Texas once stood is now just farmland. There is no marker, no monument, no sign indicating that once upon a time this was the second largest city in Texas for exactly one day. The railroad tracks are long gone. The only way you would know anything happened there is if someone told you the story. But the story refuses to die. Every few years, a journalist rediscovers the crash at Crush and writes an article about it. Historians include it in books about the Wild West and the railroad era. It shows up in documentaries about dangerous stunts and publicity disasters. The internet has given it new life, with videos and articles reaching millions of people who would never have heard of it otherwise. And here is the uncomfortable truth that we have to face. The reason this story survives is not because it was a disaster. The reason it survives is because it was spectacular. Because 40,000 people witnessed something that had never been done before and has never been done since. Because for one perfect moment before everything went wrong, two trains met in the middle of Texas and created a scene of destruction so total, so overwhelming, that everyone who saw it knew they had witnessed history. We tell ourselves we are horrified by the tragedy. And we are. But we are also fascinated by the spectacle. We always have been. We always will be. So what do we learn from the day Texas built a city just to watch two trains destroy each other? What lesson can we take from this bizarre chapter of American history? The easy answer is that you should not stage dangerous stunts for public entertainment without proper safety measures. Do not underestimate the power of physics. Do not assume that just because something seems like a good idea in theory, it will work out fine in practice. These are all valid lessons, and they are all completely useless because humans never actually learn them. We are still doing the same thing today. We just do it differently. Instead of staging train crashes, we watch demolition derbies and monster truck rallies and extreme sports where people risk their lives for our entertainment. We watch buildings get demolished and bridges get blown up. We slow down to look at car accidents on the highway, even though we know we should just keep driving. The appetite for spectacle, for destruction, for that moment when everything goes wrong is as strong now as it was in 1896. The crash at Crush was not an accident. It was intentional destruction turned into entertainment, and 40,000 people thought that was a great way to spend their day. They paid money for it. They traveled for it. They brought their children to watch it, and when it went wrong, when people died, the event did not fade into shameful obscurity. It became a legend. That tells us something uncomfortable about human nature. We are drawn to destruction. We want to see what happens when forces collide, when structures fail, when chaos is unleashed. We tell ourselves we are there to appreciate the engineering, the physics, the historical significance. But really, we are there for the same reason those 40,000 people stood in the Texas heat on September 15, 1896. We want to see something break in spectacular fashion. The difference between then and now is that we have gotten better at making destruction safe for spectators. We have barriers and safety zones and insurance policies. And we have engineers who calculate debris fields and engineers who design failure modes. We have learned how to give people the spectacle they crave while minimizing the body count. Progress of a sort. William George Crush understood something that modern marketing executives spend millions to figure out. Give people something they have never seen before. Make it big enough and dangerous enough and spectacular enough, and they will come. They will always come. The more we tell ourselves we are civilized, the more we prove we are still the same people who would build a city just to watch trains crash. The locomotives from that day are long gone, sold for scrap or rusted into nothing. The city of Crush exists only in photographs and newspaper accounts. The people who were there are all dead now, their stories passed down through families or forgotten entirely. But the impulse that brought them there, that need to witness destruction, that fascination with spectacular failure, that is still alive and well. So the next time you find yourself watching a controlled demolition video, or slowing down to look at an accident, or clicking on footage of something going catastrophically wrong, remember those 40,000 people in the Texas heat. Remember that you are not so different from them. Remember that we are all just spectators waiting for trains to collide, hoping we are standing far enough back when they do, but never quite sure what far enough really means. The crash at Crush taught us that there is no safe distance from spectacle. There is only the illusion of safety, and the hope that when the debris flies, it flies somewhere else. And if this story grabbed your attention, if it made you think about human nature and our endless appetite for destruction, then click that like button, because clearly you are exactly the kind of person who would have bought a ticket to Crush, Texas. Hit subscribe to this channel so you do not miss tomorrow's story about the time a town tried to solve their whale problem with dynamite. Spoiler alert, it went exactly as badly as you think it did. History is full of spectacular failures, and we are going to explore every single one of them together. See you in the next story.